As we all know, August 6, 1945 opened a new era of human history. Humans had demonstrated that they have the intelligence to construct the means to destroy life on Earth. That opened a new question. Do they have the intelligence to prevent themselves from using the capacity that they had been intelligent enough to develop? And that remains a very open question, very much alive. Shortly after that event, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists established their famous Doomsday Clock. This gives a measure of how far we are from catastrophe in the estimate of eminent scientists. It's never midnight is the end. It's never been very far from midnight. Last January, it moved 2 minutes closer to midnight, 3 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it's been in 30 years. There was a statement that accompanied the move towards midnight. It said it identified two threats: nuclear weapons and unchecked, I'm quoting it, unchecked climate change. The call condemned world leaders who have failed to act with the speed or on the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe, endangering every person on Earth by failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization. Well, on climate change, world leaders are now meeting in Paris, but it's not likely that they will act with the speed and the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe. And even if they do, by some near miracle, it's not clear how much value that would be for reasons that happen to lie very close to home. So in all of the huge media coverage of these Paris events, perhaps the most important sentences are these, buried near the end of a long New York Times analysis. I'll read it. Traditionally, negotiators have sought to forge a legally binding treaty that needed ratification by the governments of the participating countries to have force. There is no way to get that in this case because of the United States. A treaty would be dead on arrival on Capitol Hill without the required 2/3 majority vote in the Republican-controlled Senate. So the voluntary plans are taking the place of mandatory top-down targets, and voluntary plans, of course, are a guarantee of failure. This is, notice, the New York Times, quite conservative newspaper, emphasizing the phrase "because of the United States," and more precisely, because of the Republican Party, which is by now a real danger to decent human survival. The Republican primaries may be a good way to elicit some laughs as comedy shows, but the fact is it's not funny. It's not happening in Andorra. Both parties have moved well to the right in the past generation, the neoliberal period. Mainstream Democrats are now what used to be called moderate Republicans. Somebody like Eisenhower would be way at the left end of the spectrum today. In fact, his views in many respects are not different from Bernie Sanders. Meanwhile, the Republicans have just drifted off the spectrum. They're not a political party in any traditional sense, and this is recognized. The two scholars of the leading political analysts of the American Enterprise Institute, Thomas Mann, Norman Ornstein, recently described the Republican Party or former Republican Party as a radical insurgency which has abandoned any concern for participation in parliamentary politics. It's something not entirely new in Western history, but if you think back to the predecessors, it's not very encouraging. Meanwhile, immediately after Obama spoke in Paris, pledging that the United States would be in the vanguard of global action, the Republican-dominated Congress voted to scuttle EPA rules to cut carbon emissions. Here's the New York Times. A provocative message to more than 100 world leaders in Paris that the American president does not have the full support of his government on climate policy, which is a bit of an understatement, and it's also unique to the United States. Again, that's critical. Meanwhile, Lamar Smith, who's the Republican head of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, is carrying forward his jihad to get scientists who dare to report the facts to back off from this heresy, which all shows that there is an enormous responsibility right here. In many ways, that's a good message. It means we can do something about it. Nobody else can. Well, there are companion stories in the New York Times which report, I'll quote again, that 2/3 of Americans support the United States joining a binding international agreement to curb growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And by a ratio of 5 to 3, they regard climate issues as more important than the economy. But notice that that doesn't matter. The US will still block any effort to move in this direction, which is again a pretty strong message to us. Tells us something about our responsibilities. It illustrates the extent to which the fate of the world is actually in our hands, dramatically so, and not least because of our, by now, almost completely dysfunctional political system. Barely resembles functioning democracy, a system in which popular opinion is a marginal factor. There are other reports on the Paris talks that discuss the possibility of what's called a global carbon budget, limit on the total amount of carbon that can be produced, presumably as a result of a treaty to limit emissions. If you look at these sort of pie, who would produce how much, it turns out that the West and China they would consume the pie. They'd produce all of everything. But even that is described as politically impossible. Can't be accepted in the United States. That's a very interesting notion. Is it politically impossible because of public opposition? Obviously not. Polls indicate the opposite. This is a familiar concept in recent US political discourse. Actually, it showed up at the time when, a couple of years ago, when there was debate about doing something with the scandalous health system, international scandal, twice the per capita costs of other countries, relatively poor outcomes, highly bureaucratized, inefficient, and there have been concerns about doing something about it. Actually, the public has had opinions on this. And for years, the public has been pretty strongly in favor of some form of national health care. In fact, not long ago, polls showed that about a quarter of the public thought that it ought to be a constitutional guarantee. Actually, a majority of the public thought it ought to be a constitutional guarantee, and about a quarter of the public thought it already was in the Constitution because it's just an obvious desideratum. Does it matter? No, it doesn't. If you look at the political commentary on it, when these facts are discussed, it's described as politically impossible. You cannot institute what the majority of the public want because of the preponderant influence of pharmaceutical corporations, insurance companies, financial institutions. That determines what's politically possible. When Obama put in his own proposals, you recall there was what was called a public option. You could opt for a national health to participate in, say, Medicare, national health care. It was favored by about 5-3, but it wasn't even discussed. It was simply dropped because it's assumed across the political system that a large majority of the population is irrelevant. It's politically impossible. The same with climate change. What is politically impossible, in fact, is up to us, and there are another indication that there are huge tasks ahead for those of us who care about the fate of the species, the fate of your own grandchildren. Well, let's put climate change aside and turn to nuclear weapons, a danger that is very much underestimated. Actually, we've lived with it for 70 years, and the fact that we're here to talk about it is pretty much a miracle. If you look closely at the record, it is hair-raising. I mentioned that the Doomsday Clock had moved 2 minutes forward up towards midnight, reaching the point where it was 30 years ago. What was happening 30 years ago? 30 years ago, the Reagan administration was carrying out highly provocative operations. It was simulating attacks on Russia, air and naval and ground attacks, to try to elicit information about Russian defenses. Operation Able Archer, it was called. This was a very tense moment. Pershing II missiles were being installed in Western Europe. They had maybe a 10-minute flight time to Moscow. Reagan was initiating the so-called Star Wars program, which strategic analysts on all sides understand to be a first strike weapon. Even if it might work, who knows? But if it worked, it would eliminate a deterrent and therefore be a first strike weapon. And right in the middle of that, the Able Archer operations began. Here's the way they're described by Mel Goodman, who was at the time the CIA division chief and the senior analyst at the Office of Soviet Affairs. He says, in addition to the Able Archer mobilization exercises, which I just described, the exercises that deeply alarmed the Kremlin, the Reagan administration authorized unusually aggressive military exercises near the Soviet border that in some cases violated Soviet territorial sovereignty. The Pentagon's risky measures included sending U.S. strategic bombers over the North Pole to test Soviet radar and naval exercises in wartime approaches to the USSR, where U.S. warships had previously not entered. Additional secret operations simulated surprise naval attacks on Soviet targets. And Goodman warns that that situation is recurring today with potential confrontations and rising tensions. At the time, it was known that the Russians were concerned. Now that Russian archives have come out, it becomes clear that they were deeply concerned. Contemporary U.S. intelligence reports analyzing that period conclude, I'm quoting, that the war scare was real. It was close. 3 minutes to midnight was no joke, could have been closer. Right in the middle of all of this, the Russian automated response systems detected a U.S. missile strike. That, I should say, happens all the time. But they detected a strike. There's a protocol. There's a human being, his name happened to be Stanislav Petrov, who was supposed to take the information and transmit it to the high command, which then decides or not to launch a retaliatory strike. Stanislav Petrov decided not to transmit the information. And that's why we're here, literally. And it's not the only time. That was 30 years ago. Now we're back there. Let me give a couple of other examples to give the flavor of this, because it's happening all the time. It was just reported a couple of weeks ago that in 1979, the US automated systems detected a Russian missile strike. Again, goes to the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He's supposed to decide whether to call the president and launch a strike. He was about a minute away from calling President Carter to tell him to authorize a strike, which incidentally would destroy civilization. And when news came in that it was an error, one of thousands of errors, so we were spared that one. Bruce Blair, who's a nuclear security specialist, just revealed that, and he describes a couple of other cases. He says that in 1967, an aircraft carrier with nuclear aircraft was sent an actual attack order saying, go off and blow the world up. This was by mistake. It was supposed to be an exercise training nuclear order. Again, kind of thing that happens all the time. In the early 70s, again, Blair, the Strategic Air Command transmitted an exercise launch order as an actual real world launch order, quoting Blair again. Incidentally, it has been known for 30 years that if a major nuclear power were to carry out a first strike, that power itself would be destroyed, even with no retaliation, simply because of the effects of nuclear winter. So a first strike is suicide. That's been known for at least 30 years. Bruce Blair made the comments I just quoted in response to an interesting report that was just cleared a couple of weeks ago by the US Air Force. It was a report by a guy named John Bordney. He's an airman who served on a US military base in Okinawa in 1962 at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis has been described pretty accurately as the most dangerous moment in human history. That's Arthur Schlesinger, a Kennedy advisor, historian. At that time, the US nuclear alert had risen to the second highest level, what's called DEFCON 2. If it goes up to DEFCON 1, you shoot the bombs. But it was at DEFCON 2 at that time. And this guy is at a military base in Okinawa. I'll return later to what it was doing there. This is at the peak of at the peak of the crisis. This is October 28th. The missile crews, including his, received authorization to launch nuclear missiles. That would be at China. At a very tense period, I might say. China and India were at war at the time. Well, they decided not to. That's our Petrov that time. It happens very frequently. There's an expert study that just came out reviewing about 3 years of detection by automated systems, warning of a nuclear attack. They found dozens every year. They said it might go up to hundreds every year. And we don't have the last couple of years, but there's no reason to believe it's any better. Incidentally, the US systems are the most sophisticated by far. US radar covers the world. Russian radar and other countries is line of sight. They don't have much information. So their systems are surely not as sophisticated as ours. And we have the details from US systems, which are absolutely horrifying. You can imagine what it's like elsewhere, especially in places like, say, Pakistan, where they have a huge nuclear weapons system. But as Pakistani nuclear scientists point out, the system is they have 20,000 soldiers to try to protect the nuclear weapons system from jihadi elements. But the trouble is that those military units have infiltrated constantly by jihadi elements. We don't know how far they are from having their hands on the nuclear trigger. Again, we can thank Ronald Reagan in particular for this. He helped Pakistan develop its nuclear weapon system, pretending they didn't know about it during the period when Pakistan was being radically Islamized by Saudi money, Wahhabization, and U.S. support. It goes on like that. Well, there is a pretty good book by Eric Schlosser, American analyst, who reviews many of these cases, but none of the ones I just described. And the whole story is just literally hair-raising. And again, the Russian story is no doubt worse. Well, often these, I've just been describing accident, but often it's a matter of just straight adventurism, like Able Archer, asking for trouble. The worst case, of course, was 1962, when Khrushchev placed missiles in Cuba, most dangerous moment in world history. And it was an extremely dangerous and adventurous move. We therefore would like to know why he did it, and it's worth thinking about it. There's now very careful scholarship on this on the American side, primarily looking at the detailed record which we have available. And the conclusions are very straightforward. So why did he do it? Well, there were basically two reasons. One was the military balance. In the late 1950s, Khrushchev recognized that Russia could not possibly compete with the United States in military force if it hoped to develop. So back much, far less developed country, of course. So he offered to cut back offensive military forces on both sides. He called for a sharp cutback on military forces. The U.S. didn't respond, but he implemented the cutback anyway. The Kennedy administration considered this, recognized it, and did decide to respond, namely by sharply escalating the U.S. military budget. The U.S. was already way more advanced than the Russians in quantity, technology, missiles, everything else. But the biggest arms boost in history came along in response to Khrushchev's offer to reduce offensive military forces. Well, that led to a real military imbalance, and that was apparently one of the reasons why Khrushchev made this extremely dangerous move to put missiles in Cuba. There was a second reason. The Kennedy administration was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba. The goal of the war was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That's the phrase used by Arthur Schlesinger, again, Kennedy's advisor, in describing the program. It was run by Robert Kennedy, who took it as his highest priority, and it was no joke. When you look at the record, it's pretty shocking. This program, Operation Mongoose, it was called, was designed to lead to a U.S. invasion of Cuba in October 1962. And it's very likely that the Russians and the Cubans knew a good bit about this. That was the second reason for placing the missiles in Cuba. Very adventurous move, but not without some reasons for which we share a good bit of responsibility. Well, all of this came to a peak in late October. Many of you may recall. On October 26th, we now know Kennedy was about inclined, thinking seriously of invading Cuba. The U.S. did not know at the time that Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons there, and that many more forces than was expected, so an invasion probably would have led to a nuclear war. That day, a message came from Khrushchev offering to settle the crisis. How? By a joint agreement to publicly eliminate Cuban missiles in Russian missiles in Cuba and U.S. missiles in Turkey. The U.S. had offensive missiles aimed at Russia and Turkey, and in fact almost everywhere. Kennedy was surprised. He didn't even know there were missiles in Turkey. These were obsolete missiles, which were at that time being withdrawn because they were being replaced with much more lethal, essentially invulnerable Polaris submarines. So here was the offer. We'll withdraw the missiles from Cuba. You withdraw obsolete missiles, which you're withdrawing anyway, because you're replacing them with even more lethal missiles. Kennedy refused, literally. His own subjective probability at the time was that there was a probability of 1/3 to 1/2 of nuclear war, but wouldn't do it. It did something secretly, but wouldn't do it publicly. That's the kind of decision that our leaders make. And the most frightening part of this is that you look at Western commentary, Kennedy is praised for his cool courage, judiciousness, and so on and so forth. There's actually a kind of a reason for that. A lot of the evidence about this comes from meetings of what was called the Excom Committee. There was a secret committee set up which was debating all of this through October. And we have the minutes. The minutes are available. They were released. And if you look at those minutes, Kennedy does come out as looking kind of more balanced and sane than some of the others, which is not saying much, I should say. But there's a small footnote that's rarely mentioned. Kennedy was the only person who knew it was being taped. Nobody else knew. So he was talking for history. You can draw your own conclusions. But even what history tells us is pretty horrifying. The US was very close to war at the time. I should mention that right in the middle of this, there was another Petrov incident. Kennedy had established a quarantine around Cuba, and there were Russian submarines there with nuclear-tipped missiles. And they were being attacked with depth charges by US destroyers. And the submarine commanders, who had very little contact with the outside world, assumed that a war had started. So they were ready to launch their missiles. It took a decision by 3 submarine commanders to launch the missiles. 2 decided to launch, a 3rd decided not to. Vasily Arkhipov. That's why we're here again. These things are happening constantly. Going back to Okinawa, 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy had sent advanced missiles, nuclear missiles to Okinawa, US base there, threatening China. Again, at least as serious as Russian missiles in Cuba, and nowhere near as serious as US missiles in Turkey or the more lethal ones elsewhere. But that's the way the world works. The Russians have, thankfully, backed down time after time, and how long that can continue, we don't know. It's a miracle, literally a miracle, that we've survived. With this as a background, it's useful to think about what official US military planning is. Remember, it's known, and been known for a long time, that a first strike destroys the attacking power. No question of retaliation. That's been known for at least 30 years. So take a look at we don't have the whole declassified record, but we have some of it. Here's some. In 1995, the STRATCOM, Strategic Command, which is in charge of nuclear weapons strategy, did publish a study which was partially released, partially declassified. It's very much worth reading. It's called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. Remember, this is 5 years after the Soviet Union had collapsed. We're now talking about what do we do in the post-Cold War period. Conclusion, I'll read it. First, the US must maintain the right of first strike, even against non-nuclear states. We can't abandon that right. Furthermore, nuclear weapons must always be available, I'm quoting, because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict, meaning they're constantly used all the time just as if you and I go into a store and intending to rob it, and I have a gun, but I don't shoot it, we're still using the gun. It's a point that Dan Ellsberg has repeatedly made. So here's the official doctrine. Yes, we have to use them constantly because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. It goes on. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed, that the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be part of the national persona we project. It's beneficial to our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control, posing a constant threat of nuclear attack. That way the world is intimidated and we can do what we want. The world doesn't read these documents, but people basically know it. There are international polls run by US agencies, Gallup, asking, among other questions, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? The US is first by a huge margin. Nobody else is even close. We're protected from information like that. The free press refuses to publish it, but it's easy to find. You can look up Gallup polls. And there's worth knowing. What's current doctrine right now? Well, it's just you take a look at the MIT journal, International Security. It's one of the major scholarly journals on these issues, current issue. It says, this lead article talks about the US and China, says the US is committed to what's called strategic primacy. Strategic primacy means immunity from any retaliatory strike. So not just you can deter others, but you can carry out a first strike and you're immune to retaliation. That's strategic primacy. That's US doctrine. Obama, it goes on, is expanding, developing a new triad. The triad means the three prongs of the nuclear attack system: land, sea, and air. So those are being expanded. Missile defense is expanding. Everyone understands that to be a first strike weapon. And there is a concern. The article's about the concern. China might react. So far, China hasn't done anything. They reject first strike. They've rejected that doctrine. They don't have many missiles. But with all of this happening, and they can figure it out, they might react. Well, the two scholars who write the article think they're probably not going to react, so maybe we're lucky. But it clearly increases the danger. The same is happening around Russia. This goes back to immediately after, at the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was discussion between Mikhail Gorbachev and, at that time, President Bush #1 and James Baker as Secretary of State about how to deal with it. Gorbachev made an actual remarkable concession. He agreed to allow a unified Germany to join NATO, a hostile military alliance. You look back at the history of the 20th century and you can see what that means. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times. But he was saying, okay, a unified Germany can join a hostile military alliance with one condition, that NATO not move to East Germany. The phrase was, not 1 inch to the east. He got a verbal agreement that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch to the east, but NATO immediately moved to East Germany. And when there were complaints, Washington pointed out it was only a verbal agreement, implying if you're naive enough to accept a gentleman's agreement with the United States, it's your problem. So NATO moved to East Germany. Clinton moved it further east, right to the Russian borders. It's continuing. Now the threat is, and it's a serious threat, to incorporate Ukraine in NATO. That's right at the core of Russian geostrategic interests, let alone historical reasons. Well, one can imagine how the US would react if the Warsaw Pact were still alive. And Latin America, almost all of Latin America joined the Warsaw Pact. And now there were moves to incorporate Mexico and Canada into the Warsaw Pact. How would we respond? We don't have to raise that question. The first step, long before, would have blown up the world, obviously. But that's what our adversaries face. It's not that they're nice people. They can be horrible people, but you have to understand how they can react to a geostrategic situation that is of the kind that I just described and is familiar to everyone who pays attention. Russians understand, as well as China, that the U.S. is seeking strategic primacy, that the expansion of the military system, the actions near the Russian border, the missile defense are a serious threat to them. And they react. They react with dangerous actions, very dangerous. And then NATO has to react to defend its NATO territories against potential Russian aggressiveness. There's one prominent, the leading, in fact, British scholar of Ukraine who points out, describes what he calls a fateful geographical paradox. NATO exists today to manage the risks created by its existence. It's pretty accurate if you look at it. And the threats are very serious right now. You read a couple weeks about the Russian plane, military jet shot down allegedly over Turkish territory. Take a look at the map. That is a piece of Turkey that protrudes deeply into Syria, where the plane was bombing jihadi forces. It passed through, according to Turkish reports, it passed through a little corner of this territory on a bombing mission for 17 seconds. For a jet plane that's like that, passed through a corner of the territory, sticking out way into Turkey. It was shot down. It was plainly aiming towards Syria. That's where it crashed when it landed. That's, again, a pretty provocative act. A few months ago, by now, there are stepped-up military maneuvers right along the NATO the Russian border. So here's quoting the Washington Post. U.S. military combat vehicles paraded through an Estonian city that juts into Russia, a symbolic act that highlighted the stakes for both sides amid the worst tensions between the West and Russia since the Cold War. Shortly before that, a Russian warplane had come within seconds of hitting a Danish commercial airliner. The major U.S. The military journal, Arms Control Today, reports that, quoting it, both sides, current issue, November, both sides are practicing rapid mobilization and redeployment of forces to the Russia-NATO border. Both sides believe a war is no longer unthinkable. If that's true, both sides are clinically insane. Again, it's been known for decades that a first strike will destroy the attacking country. If that doesn't mean a war is unthinkable, words don't have meaning. And that's the current discussion. And it's not just today. That's what we've been living through for 70 years. And the reasoning throughout is remarkable. Let me end by just giving one illustration of how high-level reasoning works. We get this from the declassified record. Not only is it striking in itself, in my view, it's pretty striking that it's never discussed. At least you make your own decisions. To me, it's horrifying. This goes back to the early post-war period, the period when the Doomsday Clock was established. At that time, the United States had overwhelming security, and nothing like it in history. The U.S. had literally half the wealth of the world. The U.S. economy had boomed during the Second World War. Other industrial societies were devastated or destroyed. The U.S. controlled the entire hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. No security threat anywhere. But there was a potential security threat. It was understood that sooner or later there would be development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, with nuclear, probably hydrogen bomb warheads. And that would be a severe threat to the United States, in fact, a threat of instant destruction. So what was the reaction? Actually, we know about this from the scholarly histories of this period. The main one was written by McGeorge Bundy, who was a national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, head of the Ford Foundation, so on and so forth. And he had access to a high-level classified material. And here's what he writes. He says that developing ICBMs with nuclear weapons was one of the best achievements of the Eisenhower years. Yet it is well to begin with a recognition that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if these missiles had never been developed. And then comes an instructive comment. I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal at that time, in or out of either government, that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement. In short, apparently nobody thought of the possibility that maybe we can proceed to ban the only threat to our security, which in fact is a lethal threat, which they knew was coming. He couldn't find any comment on this in the government literature, drafts by lower level officials, anywhere. What that means is that security of the population is of zero concern to planners, literally. Incidentally, there are good reasons to think that a treaty agreement with the Russians could have been reached at that time. There's no time to go into it, but it's now pretty clear. That's the way it goes on. These are illustrations of top-level thinking and of the actions that are taking place. It happens to be that that's the world we're living in today, both on the climate change issue, where we're standing in the way of a possible agreement that might save us from real catastrophe not far away, and on the nuclear issue, where we're playing with fire at every minute. The prospects for long-term survival are not very high as long as this persists, unless there's a significant change of course, and a large part of the responsibility is right here, and the opportunities as well.